Okay, so last week, we talked about communication, which is an essential aspect of leadership, because if leaders want to get work done through other people, if they want to influence other people, they need to communicate with these other people, with these followers. And what I presented to you was this model in which there are three classes of variables that are examined: who says what to whom, or the source of the communication, the nature of the communication, and the receiver of the communication. We talked about the importance of the source. We talked about the importance of credibility. So it is not so much the nature of the communication. I mean, that is important, but it only becomes important if the receivers of the communication regard the source of the communication as credible. We talked about attractiveness and likability, and we talked about the importance of a positive relationship. So we tend to be influenced more strongly by people that we regard as attractive or likable, and not just physically attractive, but attractive in terms of who these people are, their character, and the values they stand for. And we tend to be influenced more strongly by people with whom we have a positive relationship. Then this is where we, I believe, left off last week. We talked about the nature of the communication, and I told you the story of Willie Horton. Yes, you remember the story of Willie Horton? So this was a convict who was permitted to go free and committed another crime, got caught, and this was blamed by the Bush campaign people on Michael Dukakis, who at the time was the governor of Massachusetts. So the message here was that there are these two different routes to persuasion. If you want to influence people, if you want to persuade people through a particular course of action, then the peripheral route, the emotional route, can be very powerful. Because people are not just rational creatures, they are also very emotional creatures. And many of the most important decisions we make based on our emotions, not necessarily a rational analysis of the pros and cons of different courses of action. Now this is also similar to, or it's connected to, this next point: statistical evidence versus personal examples. Interestingly enough, most people are more strongly influenced by personal examples rather than by statistical evidence. So if you want people to do something, let's say you want them to donate to a cause, you collect, let's say, money for refugees, then you could argue by giving them statistics. Here's the number of refugees that have had to flee Syria. Here's the number of refugees who are poor. And so you could provide all kinds of statistics on living conditions and on the general state of affairs. And that may or may not be effective, but generally it is much more effective if you tell the story of one individual or one family. Okay, so you tell a story. You don't give statistics, facts, and figures, but you tell a story. Because that is something that gets people more involved. It is something that tends to persuade people more strongly to do whatever it is you're asking them to do, such as to donate money. And similarly, if, for example, organizational leaders, CEOs, want to set in motion organizational change, reorganize the organization, perform a strategic change, then this is something that you could also argue for by providing statistics, facts, and figures, but you could also use stories. There are a lot of books on leadership written by practitioners that are about just this, how to lead with stories. There are at least a dozen books on exactly this topic, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that great leaders have used stories a lot to inspire people, to guide people, to lead people. Okay, and this is very well backed by scientific evidence. There are these kinds of studies, for example, conducted by people who have approached others on the street, and it was tested what is the method, what is the type of communication that is most likely to get people to donate to a cause, whatever the cause may be, donating for refugees, ending world hunger, doing something for the environment, whatever the cause may be. There are these two approaches. There's the central route and the peripheral route. There's the route that relies on statistical evidence, and then there is the route that relies on personal examples and telling stories. And on average, and for most people, this emotional appeal, the story approach using personal examples is more effective, more persuasive. Now, the next thing you see here, one-sided versus two-sided presentations. We already touched on this a couple of weeks ago when I showed you the study that examined how visionary leaders should communicate. And you might remember that these researchers examined the interaction effect between number of values and use of imagery. And the best combination they found was to use a lot of imagery, so to use words that elicit mental pictures inside of people's heads, and combine that with a focus on few values. Not a lot of values, but one or two values. Now this is also, is about that aspect of communication. It is about how much information should you provide. And the idea, or the findings here in this research show that it is best not to provide too much information, not necessarily to say everything you know. Let's say you're an organizational leader. Don't confuse your workforce by telling them everything that you know about the situation. Yes, you can provide that kind of information if people ask questions, and you can provide more and more information. But there is, in communication research, this effect called the dilution effect, which means that if you provide too much information, then you dilute your strongest arguments. So if you have 4, 5, 6 different arguments, all in favor of pursuing a particular course of action, then that is too much. You will be diluting your strongest arguments. It is better to focus on a small number of arguments and then build those, elaborate those. Right? Just like it's very much in line with that study that we looked at, in which the authors found that a focus on relatively few values is preferable to listing all kinds of values. This is, by the way, also something that has been studied quite a bit in marketing and in sales. Salespeople are told not to dilute their strongest sales arguments by providing all kinds of additional arguments. Focus on the strongest arguments, and don't weaken those by throwing in all kinds of additional, maybe not so strong arguments. I just want to, it's not on here, but it's something that I just want to share with you because I find it interesting, and it is also something that I've been thinking about again and again over the last couple of months when reading about politics. There's also in communication research an effect that is called the perseverance effect. Perseverance effect. Anybody ever heard of this? Okay, essentially this is about the notion that if you spread a rumor about, let's say, your political opponent or some other person, and you know that it's untrue, so it's a lie, it is fake news, then the perseverance effect states that even if it gets discredited, something is going to stick. Okay, so also for in political campaigns, once this was discovered in the last, I don't know when exactly, but there's been more and more research, so this research has also influenced political campaigns, especially in the United States over the last 20 years. And the motto is, throw with mud, something is going to stick. Okay? So even if the other person, figuratively, cleans off the mud, something is going to remain. You tell a lie about a person, even if the lie gets discredited, something is going to stick in people's minds. Or you spread fake news, a lot of people are still going to think, yeah, but maybe some of it was true. Maybe it's not completely false. Okay, so this can be a strategy. Telling lies, spreading fake news can be a strategy. You know exactly that it's not true, but you use it anyway because you know that it's going to have an effect, and this is the perseverance effect. Something's going to stick, something's going to linger, even after the information that you have spread has been discredited and has been shown to be incorrect. Okay, so it's actually a very effective way of fighting opponents, whether it is inside an organization, people who want the same promotion that you want, whether it's in politics. It is actually a quite effective, it's not ethical, obviously, but research shows that it is relatively effective. Ideally, if you can get other people to spread those news and to tell those lies, so if people then can't identify you as the source of circulating this information, then you can only benefit, you cannot lose. Okay, the next point up here is the order of presentation. And there are these two important effects. One is called the primacy effect and one is called the recency effect. And that means that you should put your strongest arguments at the beginning of your communication and at the end. What you say in the middle is really not all that important. People's minds wander off in the middle. So the important thing is what you say at the start and at the end. And start strong, end strong. The middle is not so important. There are a lot of studies that have shown that people remember best what the information that is provided in the beginning of a talk or presentation and at the end, but they don't remember so well what happens in the middle. There are also studies with the brain studies that have shown that there's less focused attention in the middle of presentations and more at the beginning and at the end. Size of discrepancies, this pertains to the question, how much change can you ask for as a leader? Can you ask for major organizational change, or should you ask for more incremental steps? And an important moderator comes into play here. When researchers first examined this question, they found very mixed results in different studies. Some studies showed that leaders are most effective if they ask for big change, major change. Other studies showed that leaders are most effective if they ask for small, incremental change. And then still other researchers showed that which of these is best, whether you should ask for big change or small change, depends on a moderator variable. And this moderator variable is the credibility that the leader has. So a very credible leader is most effective if he or she asks for big change, for major change. If, however, the leader is not very credible, this leader would be most effective if he or she asked for small incremental changes. And the credibility, of course, is not something that is objective. It is the credibility in the eyes of the followers, or in the eyes of the people through whom the leader does his or her work. So Steve Jobs, for example, was a leader who was extremely credible in the eyes of his workforce, had very, very high approval ratings, and he was very effective in asking for big changes, major changes. Now, when a leader knows that he or she is less credible in the eyes of the followers, then it's better to ask for more incremental changes because big changes are likely to be rejected. Then let's come to this point here, framing of information. This is a category that is frequently associated with Kahneman and Tversky. Kahneman is a Nobel Prize winning, originally he's a psychologist, but he won the Nobel Prize in economics, and this is one of his most famous findings. So let me show you here one of the studies that he used to demonstrate this framing effect. So imagine that you are in this scenario. You are the President of the United States, and the country is bracing itself for the outbreak of an unusual epidemic expected to kill 600 people. Your top advisors have prepared 2 alternative programs to combat the disease and have estimated to the best of their ability the likely consequences of adopting each program. Now, Mr. or Mrs. President, which program do you favor? If program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. If program B is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. Okay, so that's program A. Here's another way of presenting this information. If program A is adopted, 400 people will die. If program B is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that nobody will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. So what's different? Presenting the information in this way or presenting the information in this way, objectively, isn't really any different. So the outcomes are the same. But what is different is whether the positive or the negative is emphasized. So do you focus on gains or lives saved, or do you focus on losses, lives lost? And even though the objective information is exactly the same, the presentation apparently is very important, because as you can see here, if information was presented in this way, 72% of the study subjects favored program A. However, if information was presented in this way, 78% of the study subjects favored program B. How can that be? Because the information was the same. It was just framed differently. That's why framing of information seems to be really important. Kahneman and Tversky showed in this study and many other studies that people really dislike losses. And most people, well, about 3/4, this is quite consistent in other studies as well, about 3/4 of all people, 75% of all people, dislike losses more than they like gains. So in other words, just to give you a simple example, the intensity of the negative emotions experienced if you lost 100 euros is greater than the intensity of the positive emotions that you would experience if you gained 100 euros? Now, so think about it for a moment. What would be a stronger experience? Finding 100 euros on the street or losing 100 euros that were in your pocket? Yeah, so this is something that has been shown consistently, and Kahneman and Tversky have thought of literally dozens of different experiments in which they always showed the importance of the framing of information. Let me give you more examples, or one more example, of a field experiment. Okay? Again, field experiments are very, very difficult, but they're great because they have both high internal and high external validity. This was not conducted, the study, by Kahneman and Tversky, but by other researchers who also did work on this framing phenomenon. What they did was they worked with companies that provided home insulation. You know, you can have your home insulated so that the heat stays inside, that you don't lose the heat, and that you don't have to spend a lot of money on heating a home that never really gets warm because all the heat somehow goes out through the windows or cracks on the wall or whatever. So home insulation is provided by these firms, and the researchers went with these home improvement specialists to customers or prospective customers. Okay, and to some of these, and this was determined at random. This is one of the principles of experimentation, that you determine at random who is in which experimental condition. So half of these people who were visited and who were made an offer on home improvement, home insulation, they were told that, well, first an analysis was made. What does their home look like? Where are they? Where is the insulation poor? What would have to be improved in order for them to save money on heating? And for half of these, the communication was, if you had this done, these procedures that we are recommending to you, then you could be saving amount X. And this was actually a true amount, what actually was correct for their particular case. Okay, so they gave them this figure. This is the amount of money that you could be saving on your heating bills if you had these procedures done. Now, in the other half, in the other experimental conditions, people were told, by not having this done, by not having home insulation done, you are pretty much throwing away money, and the amount of money that you are throwing away every year is the amount, and then they gave them the amount that was true for that particular household. So, what do you think the difference was? In which condition was it more likely that people said, okay, then please, I want this insulation to be installed? Yes?
In the second case?
Yes, exactly. People dislike losses more than they like gains. So people were more than twice as likely to have these home insulation procedures performed if they were told that they are throwing money out the window. Every year they are losing a lot of money. That was a much more effective strategy to get people to take action than was telling them how much money they could save. Now, the implications of this are quite interesting. Every now and then one hears advice such as, focus on the positive, tell people the positive things. But that apparently is not the most effective way of getting people to take action. For most people, it is more effective to point out to them what they stand to lose by not taking action. Only 1 out of 4 people is are more likely to be motivated to take action if they are told what they stand to gain by taking action. But if you don't know who you're talking to, then chances are that these individuals you're speaking to will be more representative of this majority, the majority who really dislikes losses and is more motivated by being informed of the negative consequences of not taking action. So if you want to get people to support organizational change or do something, whatever it may be, the most effective way of getting people to expend effort is actually to tell them what they stand to lose by not doing it. Now that is not to say that you couldn't combine the two. Of course you can combine the two. You can point out what the drawbacks are of not taking action, and you can complement that also with pointing out what people stand to gain. But what is one of the least effective ways of getting people to expend a lot of effort is to only focus on the positive. That is not a very promising approach. Okay. Now, the last category of variables here, we talked about the sender of the communication, we talked about, or the source of the communication, we talked about the nature of the communication, and now let's briefly talk about the receiver of the communication. Let me maybe, before we get to that, let me talk about one other aspect here. Key aspects of communication. There's some really fascinating research on how to present information using percentages. And some very interesting studies were conducted with doctors. And it appears that oftentimes the information that doctors provide is not very accurate because doctors, like most people, have great trouble understanding percentages. Now, let me give you an example of one study. In this study, doctors were asked a question. So imagine you're a doctor, and you get the following information. About 1% of women contract breast cancer at some point during their lives, okay? Beyond a certain age. Okay? So the prevalence of this disease is 1%. 1% of women in a particular age category have breast cancer. And now a procedure is performed, a mammography is performed to detect whether one individual woman actually has breast cancer. Yes, so you want to know, do I have breast cancer? Right? So, 1% of all women have breast cancer, but do I have it? So a woman goes to have a mammography performed, and then under the condition that a woman actually has breast cancer, the likelihood that this mammography will be positive is 90%. Under the condition that the woman does not have breast cancer, the likelihood that the mammography is still going to be positive is 10%. Okay, so you have three pieces of information. You have the base rate, 1% of women have breast cancer. If a woman has breast cancer, the likelihood that her mammography is going to be positive is 90%. If a woman does not have breast cancer, the likelihood that her mammography nevertheless will be positive is 10%. Now imagine you are the doctor, and now a woman sits in front of you whose mammography screening has just been positive, and now she wants to know, dear doctor, So given this, I have a positive test result. What is the likelihood that I actually have breast cancer? What are you going to tell her? And by the way, the person who conducted this research was a professor by the name of Gerd Gigerenzer, who is or used to be, the director of the Max Planck Institute in Berlin. Asked this question to lots of doctors. Now, even heads of big hospitals, Chefärzte, and he went around the world. He asked people in different countries, and he also asked people, gynecologists and radiologists, people who are actually experts with regard to this procedure. And he found out that people said anything between 1% and 99%. So these doctors gave answers that were some doctors said 1%, others said 99%. And there were sort of three categories of doctors. Some sort of said somewhere between 90 and 99%. So that was one strong group. There was one group that was sort of in the middle, around 50%, and one big group that was around between 1 and 10%. Okay, so apparently even these experts didn't know what to do with this information. And Gigerenzer says that when communicating information, people have a very hard time dealing with percentages. And it is better to translate percentages into natural frequencies. So how would you go about doing that? And this is, you sort of went in that direction. So you imagine there are 100 women. One of those 100 women has breast cancer. 99 do not. That one woman has a positive test result. Okay. But out of the 99 who don't have breast cancer, 10%, so let's say 10 women, also have a positive test results. Positive test results. So that means that these 10 plus the 1, 11 out of 100 have a positive test result. 11. But only 1 out of 11 who have had a positive test result actually has breast cancer. So the likelihood that a woman has breast cancer, if she has a positive test result, is 1/11, which is 9%, around 9%. Out of 100 women, 11 are going to have a positive test result, but out of those 11, only 1 actually has breast cancer. Yeah, can you follow? Is it easier if you're dealing with natural frequencies? It's way easier. Almost everybody can figure it out then. So there are a lot of these examples how statistics can lead people astray. So if you want to convey a certain impression, if you want people to commit to a certain course of action, then you can sometimes deceive people by portraying or communicating information in a way that confuses people. And then they don't know what to do with that information. Okay. So let me just mention, because I told you that Gerd Gigerenzer said that many of the things that Kahneman discovered and sort of the way that Kahneman talks about human nature, this is something that even though it got Kahneman a Nobel Prize, Gigerenzer argues that many of those things are not really correct. What's the difference between the two? Kahneman argues that humans are not rational. As you can see here, they're not rational. I mean, this is not rational. And there are many other ways in which humans are not rational. There are all kinds of so-called heuristics. Heuristics are ways in which humans process information, and in doing so, they deviate from rationality. And so Kahneman identified all these different heuristics. One other example is what he calls the availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is about people being strongly influenced by information that is currently available to them. So, for example, what are you more afraid of? Are you more afraid of sharks or cows? Most people are more afraid of sharks, right? Because you read about sharks attacking people in the ocean. However, cows kill way more people than sharks. It's just that you never read about it in the news because it's not very sensational if you hear about a person getting killed by a cow. Right? But if a shark kills a person, then that is something that you read about in the news. But sharks actually do not account for a lot of deaths among humans. Sharks are actually, now in relative terms, quite harmless. There are many, many other animals who kill way more people than sharks. For example, cows. So anyway, the view that Kahneman presents of humans is that they suffer from all these heuristics, and these heuristics lead people astray. You think the world is very different from the way it actually is because of all these heuristics, like the availability heuristic. There's also the confirmation bias. People tend to confirm what they believe to be true. So they cling to the information that supports what they believe, and they filter out and disregard and forget about the information that shows that maybe what people believe isn't correct. So there are many, many such examples. And Kahneman's view of human nature is that humans are very flawed. They're totally irrational. Okay, so an example of the confirmation bias is that you're the CEO of a company and you want to buy some smaller company, some small startup company. You don't know how it's going to go. I mean, on average, these acquisitions are not very successful. Only 1 in 3 is successful, meets the expectations. 2 out of 3 are unsuccessful. They fall behind expectations. And so you think about whether you should acquire this small company. And then you look at all the pros and you look at all the cons. And so Kahneman would argue that even though, of course, this is uncertain how it's going to go, you are biased. You will place too much of an emphasis on the information that supports the course of action that you prefer, and you discount too much and take into account too little the information that would argue against taking the course of action that you are about to pursue. Gigerenzer differs from Kahneman in that he says that these heuristics are not necessarily bad. So Kahneman says they're bad. They make us irrational. They make us do stupid things. Gigerenzer has this view of human nature that these heuristics, not always, of course, sometimes people make very poor decisions, but oftentimes people make good decisions based on these heuristics, the simplified way of information processing. So there's evidence to support either perspective. It's not that one is correct, the other one is wrong. So Gigerenzer does a lot of research that shows that oftentimes people do quite well when they rely on their intuitions. And he says that this is always the case when there's uncertainty. So what is a scenario of uncertainty? For example, acquiring a company. That is something where it's just not possible to know exactly how this is going to go. At other times, however, there is objective information and the correct answer could theoretically be found. When that is so, it is not good to rely on heuristics. Then you need to rationally process all the available information. Okay, but whenever something is uncertain, then one argument that could be presented is that intuition has its place. This could also be when, for example, you hire somebody. You could just rely on the objective information that is in front of you, but this is a scenario that involves a lot of uncertainty. There isn't one correct answer who the better, more suitable candidate is. And whenever uncertainty is involved, then at least the perspective that Gigerenzer prefers is that you should also, there's just no way of finding a correct solution by just relying on rationality. So emotionality or heuristics have their place in these kinds of situations. Whereas Kahneman would argue more that you should rely on your rationality and not your emotionality. I think it's fascinating research, which is also, of course, very, very important for leaders. To what extent should leaders rely on their intuition? And of course, this has been studied multiple times, and it is often argued that intuition on the part of leaders is oftentimes something that develops as people become more experienced. So if you've been in a situation many times before, and or the situation you're currently facing, the challenge you're currently facing is very similar to challenges that you've faced in the past, then you are better equipped to make a good decision, even if it's not a decision that was reached by rationally analyzing the pros and cons of various courses of action. But experience prepares people to make good intuitive decisions. And this is something that, or this idea has been supported in studies in various different domains. It has also been studied a lot with professional athletes. And it has also been studied with managers. Managers make better intuitive decisions if they are experienced in making exactly those kinds of decisions. Okay, now let's turn to the final category of variables in this communication framework, the receiver. Intelligence and knowledge. Now, what does that mean? It means that if the receiver, so imagine you're this leader here, and you as this leader are talking to these people, and you want to convince them of something. Strategic change. We're going to do something different. Okay? We are going to sell several of our business units and start something completely new. Yes, you are giving this presentation and you want to persuade them to go along and support this new strategic orientation. If these people that you're talking to are highly intelligent and highly knowledgeable, they are going to be harder to influence. Okay, so people who are, the more intelligent and the more knowledgeable people are, all other things being equal, the harder they are to influence. And there's a very simple explanation for that. People who are highly intelligent and highly knowledgeable generally think they know it all. Well, even if they don't know it all, they know a lot. They know enough not to be convinced easily. On the other hand, people who know that maybe they're not extremely intelligent, not extremely knowledgeable, maybe more open because they know, well, there's so many things that I don't know. So maybe what this person here is saying is really very smart. Then there's a variable called core self-evaluation, and this is essentially the emotions, not just the emotions, but also how people feel about themselves and how people think about themselves. So you could also call it self-view, self-image. Self-esteem is part of it, self-esteem, self-confidence. So people with high core self-evaluations are people who think positively about themselves and feel positively about themselves. They feel good about themselves. Okay, and these people are not so easily convinced. People with low core self-evaluations are easier to convince. Once again, we talked about many weeks ago, or not that many, but a few weeks ago, we talked about visionary leadership. We also talked about cult leaders, religious leaders, these visionary, charismatic figures. Who are they most likely to influence? They are most likely to influence people who are a little bit unsure of themselves, don't have very high self-esteem. They have low core self-evaluations. They don't really know what their position is in life, what they want to stand for. These people are more easily lured into cults or sects. Next one is personality. An important variable of the top 5 is openness. People who are open are more easily convinced, persuaded. People who are closed-minded are very, very hard to convince. Then values, the values that people have. So here, what's important here is the congruence between the values that underlie the communication that is presented and the values that the recipients of the communication have. So if you as a leader communicate something that is totally in line with the values of your followers, then you are more likely to get your followers to go along with what you want them to do. And then finally, age. All other things being equal, which means, yes, of course, there are many exceptions, but on average, younger people are more easily convinced than older people. Older people are more set in their ways. So if you want major organizational change and you have a very young workforce, it's more likely that this is going to go well than if you have a relatively old workforce. There will be more resistance. This topic, abusive supervision. So we've talked a lot in recent weeks about positive leadership styles. We talked about empowering leadership and directive leadership and compared and contrasted the two. We talked about charismatic and visionary and transformational leadership. And what we're going to look at now is a different kind of leadership. Scholars oftentimes don't even call it leadership, but they call it supervision, because leadership for some scholars is always good. I might have told you that one of the major scholars in the transformational leadership literature had this Hitler problem when they started researching transformational leadership. There were a lot of people who said, yeah, but Hitler was also visionary and charismatic to many people. He was transformational, he argued for a lot of change. So Hitler would be an example of the kind of leadership that you now regard as being so great. And then they had to deal with that, and they sort of said, no. Well, leadership is always good. If it's positive, if it's ethical, then it's leadership. And if it's bad, then we're going to call it something else. We're not even going to call it leadership. We're going to call it abusive supervision. We could also call it exploitative supervision, but let's not call it leadership because leadership is good. Let's reserve that term for leaders who have positive influence. Okay, so abusive supervision, this is essentially leaders who are bad, who are abrasive, who are rude, who yell at their followers, who ridicule their followers, tell them they're stupid, criticize them in front of others. And what does that do? What effects does that have? These are the results of a meta-analysis, relatively recent, published in 2015. Counterproductive work behaviors. What you see here, by the way, in parentheses, that is I believe it's the range. No, it's the 80% credibility interval. So this shows you, yes, it shows you the range of correlations found in the literature. If there's a very wide interval here, what does that mean? If there's a wide interval, what implications does that have? Both for theory and for practice. Very similar to what we talked about several weeks ago, yeah? Yes, there are moderator variables. It's not always the same. So, what we have here, counterproductive work behavior. An average correlation of 0.41, right? Remember, meta-analyses, they lump together lots of individual studies, lots of individual correlations are thrown sort of in one big figurative pot, and you calculate the average relationship, the average correlation, which in this case is 0.41. Abusive supervision correlates with counterproductive work behavior 0.41. However, so that's the average. However, there's quite a bit of variance. Quite a bit of variance. As you can see here, sometimes it's really, really high, and sometimes the relationship is almost negligible. Yeah, what do you think might be a moderator variable? Under what conditions might abusive supervision lead to more counterproductive work behaviors, and under what conditions to less? Now, what are counterproductive work behaviors? People bullying others, so showing rude behaviors to other followers, or stealing stuff, engaging in all kinds of unethical behaviors. Well, one moderator is the extent to which people are likely to get caught exhibiting counterproductive work behaviors. So, for example, people stealing stuff. If you have, a lot of monitoring measures in place, people don't have opportunities for stealing things, then they're less likely to do so. Which is not necessarily to say that it's good to install video cameras everywhere and monitor every move that employees make, because you have to look at the root cause of counterproductive work behavior. Why do people want to engage in counterproductive work behavior in the first place? Okay, but this would be one moderator. Are they likely to be found out or not? So people who have a lot of leeway, lots of freedoms in their work, who are led by abusive supervisors, are more likely to engage in counterproductive work behaviors because they know that, hey, I can get back at my supervisor. I can steal all this stuff. Nobody's going to find out. And I'm going to do it because I want to sort of get back at my supervisor. Depression, Now sometimes here these relationships are not so high, but on the other hand they're also not so low, because if you think about it, whether or not a follower develops a depression is dependent on many different factors, and obviously your leader is only one of those factors. But together, several of these negative influences can then cause a depression. So this is definitely not negligible. Also, emotional exhaustion, work to family conflict. So these are all variables that appear to be, if we assume that the direction of causality is probably from the abusive supervision to these outcomes, which makes a lot more sense. It doesn't really make so much sense to say because a follower experiences work to family conflict, the leader exhibits abusive supervision. That doesn't make that much sense. It makes a lot more sense in the other direction. So these are variables that appear to be positively affected, variables that appear to be fostered by abusive supervision, whereas the ones down here are variables that appear to be negatively affected. So there's less job satisfaction if people are led by abusive supervisors, there's less organizational citizenship behavior, and there's lower performance. Okay, again, you see a relatively high amount of variance here. In some jobs, of course, the leaders have a lot more influence on people's performance. In other jobs, the leaders have less of an influence. Again, it's not very high, but definitely not negligible. Okay, so in other words, abusive supervision has lots and lots of negative effects and should be avoided. There's no reason for engaging in this behavior, because leaders are going to get very, very negative outcomes on the part of their followers. And what many researchers are now also looking at is what effects abusive supervision has on the leaders themselves. So this is about the effects on the followers, but maybe if leaders engage in abusive supervision, they are also affected. Maybe the leaders will also experience more stress, maybe less satisfaction, more emotional exhaustion, and even more depression if they, as leaders, engage in abusive supervision. And there are a number of studies that are currently examining this, and if these hypotheses that, yes, abusive supervisors are also negatively affected themselves, then one could build a much stronger argument to get leaders to not engage in these behaviors, even if they don't care about their followers at all. Even if they say, it doesn't matter to me whether they're satisfied. Presumably, most of them do care about themselves, and if they can be, if there are empirical results that show that if you engage in these behaviors, then you will experience higher levels of emotional exhaustion, burnout, depression, and so forth, then maybe that is an argument to get more leaders to refrain from engaging in these kinds of behaviors. Okay, here is a study that looked at how abusive supervision poisons work groups. So abusive supervision climate means that this is how members of organizational units perceive leaders to act in general, not just with regard to them as followers, but how they act in the unit in general. So These would be items such as my supervisor ridicules members of my work group. My supervisor tells members of my work group they are incompetent. So this would be abusive supervision climate. And you can see a lot of negative relationships here. Abusive supervision is negatively related to group cooperation. And one mediator variable is group identification. So there's a relatively high negative relationship between abusive supervision climate and group identification. The higher the level of abusive supervision, the lower is the group identification. And this is a mediator of the relationship between abusive supervision and group cooperation. And then there's also collective efficacy. This is the belief that I have confidence in my team's ability to be successful. I think my team does a better job at tasks than most teams. So abusive supervision climate diminishes collective efficacy, and collective efficacy in turn is positively related to group performance. So group performance is harmed and diminished through abusive supervision climate, and part of this can be explained by the mediator variable collective efficacy. There's another study on abusive supervision, and this is quite interesting because this is about retaliation. We talked about it a couple of minutes ago, counterproductive work behaviors. If you are led by an abusive supervisor, you might think about, how can I get back at the supervisor? I'm going to spread some juicy and nasty rumors about the supervisor maybe, or maybe I can steal a few things here and there. Maybe I can somehow sabotage the leader. So what can I do to get back at the leader? And this is actually something that is quite common, that people in organizations, if they feel they have been treated unjustly, unfairly by an abusive supervisor, they think about how they can retaliate. They would like to retaliate, but now the question is, will they have a chance to retaliate, maybe without harming themselves? Of course they could stand up and punch the supervisor, but then they would probably get fired. So is there a way for them to do it in a way so that they would not also harm themselves? So this study showed that abusive supervision fosters hostility towards supervisor. That's not particularly surprising. But the extent to which this is the case depends on the moderator variable self-control capacity. So there are some people who can control themselves better than others, and those who cannot control themselves very well, they experience a great deal of hostility. They would love to just get up and punch the supervisor, maybe. That would be a manifestation of high hostility. And then self-control capacity again comes into play in the relationship between feeling hostility and actually engaging in supervisor-directed aggression. Now, what does that mean? Seldom it means challenging the supervisor to a fist fight. It usually means saying mean things, saying nasty things, spreading rumors, engaging in negative gossip, doing things to harm, to sabotage the supervisor. And what's depicted here is quite complicated. I mean, you've seen similar graphs many times in this course, but usually you saw on a graph like this, you saw two slopes, right? Now here you have 4. This is a three-way interaction. A three-way interaction between abusive supervision, supervisor-directed aggression, and self-control capacity. And you see that the relationship between abusive supervision and supervisor-directed aggression is the highest, is the strongest, under the condition low coercive power, low self-control capacity. Now what does that mean? It means that in an organizational unit, there will be the highest level of aggressive behavior on the part of a follower directed at the supervisor if the leader, if the supervisor has low coercive power, so the leader can't really do anything to punish the follower, doesn't have a lot of position power to punish, and the follower has low self-control capacity. So this is a follower who has a very short fuse. If this follower gets provoked, the follower is going to immediately want to engage in some retaliatory behavior, combined with the leader not having a lot of position power. The leader cannot put the follower in his or her place. The leader cannot fire or do other things to get back at or keep under control the follower. Okay, now let's talk about this is the last topic in this course. Just a few more slides. We probably will finish this next week and then talk about this maybe for another 20 or 30 minutes. After that, in the next session, next Monday, we'll have a review of everything we've covered. So the last topic is called LMX, and LMX stands for Leader-Member Exchange. What this is about is essentially the relationships between leaders and followers. So these relationships can be positive or negative, of a high quality or of a low quality. And what is depicted here is that leaders have what's called in-groups, and leaders have what's called out-groups. So leaders have, in this particular example, this leader has 4 followers. Okay, so these 4 individuals directly report to the leader. However, these 4 individual followers do not have exactly the same type of relationship with the leader. 2 of them have a very positive, high-quality relationship with the leader. These 2, they are members of the in-group. Here's more mutual trust, greater respect, higher felt obligation in these relationships. And then there are members of the out-group. So these are followers that don't really have a very good relationship with their leaders. And this LMX theory, or this LMX literature, addresses how these relationships are formed and what the effects are of leaders having different kinds of relationships with different followers. So here are the basic assumptions. Leaders develop dyadic relationships with their followers. So you develop, as a leader, you develop a relationship with your group or your unit. Let's say this is the people here in the first and the second row. This is my group. So I develop an overall relationship with my group. But I also develop dyadic relationships with each and every follower. And the quality of the relationship will be different for each follower. Now, maybe I will have a high-quality relationship with every follower, but maybe there's going to be a lot of variance here. Maybe with some followers, I'll develop a very positive, high-quality relationship, and maybe with other followers, I'll develop a not-so-positive relationship. Okay? So leaders do not lead all of their followers in the same way. That is a basic assumption here. And the different dyadic relationships differ with respect to the quality of the relationship, There are in-groups and out-groups. People, followers I trust as a leader, and those that I don't really trust so much. Now, with regard to the theory that underlies this, there's this idea that we as human beings in our social relationships simultaneously live in two different worlds. Okay? And let me give you an example of these two different worlds. Imagine that next Christmas you go to the family of your partner, if you have a partner. So you go to your girlfriend's or boyfriend's family, and there's a wonderful dinner that your partner's mother has prepared. And at the end of the evening, it was a wonderful time. Everybody had a great time, lots of laughing, just everybody's really happy. At the end of the evening, you get up and you say to your partner's mother, "Mom, for all the love that you've put into this, how much do I owe you?" And you pull out your wallet and you take out a couple of 50 or 100 euro bills. 200 euros? No, wait. Let me make it 300. And you put money on the table. How do you think that's going to go? Probably not so well. Almost everybody immediately realizes that's quite inappropriate. The question is, why? Don't people like money? Don't they like to get rewarded for the effort that they expend? Well, yes and no, because there are these two different worlds. And one world in which we live is the world that is governed by market norms. This is a social exchange world. This is where money is something that you use to make exchanges. If you engage in an interaction with another person, it is almost always clear whether you are in this world, where money is a currency that is expected, or whether you are in the other world that you also inhabit simultaneously. And this is the world that is governed by social norms. So these are family ties or friendships. If, for example, you talk to a good friend of yours and you talk about, let's say, a relationship that you're having, and your friend gives you advice, normally you would also not pull out your wallet and offer payment. But it would be clear that this is part of this kind of a relationship. I do things for you, you do things for me, but money is not the currency we use. We use trust, we use reciprocation, time spent together. This is what makes these relationships work. And the social and the world that is governed by market norms is a different world, and yet we live in these two worlds simultaneously, but rarely do we get confused. Rarely is it the case that somebody, let's say, goes to a hairdresser, gets his or her haircut, and then afterwards sort of taps the hairdresser on the shoulder and says, "And if ever I can do anything for you, just let me know." It's very clear that in this situation, payment is required. So these are two different worlds, but these are worlds that coexist and that we inhabit simultaneously. And the relationships that we have to people in the social norms world are much deeper Okay, we feel a lot more obligation and commitment to these people with whom we interact in this social norms world, whereas the market norms world, in this world, people are completely interchangeable. Now, with regard to leadership, the quality of relationships that leaders have with their followers depends on whether this relationship is entirely restricted to economic exchanges or whether this relationship also includes these social exchanges. Okay, so if the leader develops a relationship with the follower where the follower feels valued as a person, as an individual, and not just as a human resource that could be replaced. Okay, we are going to continue with this next week. I wish you a great week. See you next Monday.